Like me, it was probably one of those subjects that you either fell asleep during or didn't pay much attention to in history class. According to the History Channel website, the Cold War refers to the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union during the aftermath of World War II. During that war, the Russians and Americans actually fought as allies. However, as time progressed, there was a lot of tension that grew between these two nations. During this period of time, our nation underwent a lot of changes and experienced some of the most groundbreaking parts of our history. In other nations, there was a lot of things going on as well. The Cold War is over now, but it has left behind many interesting things that we should all be aware of. Now you're probably asking yourself, what was the big issue? Why did we have so many problems with the Soviet Union? Well, the main reason was because of communism. As Americans, we were terrified of the spreading of the communist movement across our country and overseas. Throughout my research from history articles and the Office of Historian, I found these to be the main differences that led to conflict between us. Things like free election and no free election, mostly because we had a democratic leadership and they were communists. Just the beliefs that each country had and the things that we practice in everyday society. And we had freedom of media and they had total censorship. Harry Truman was the president of the United States at this time, and his views certainly did not match up with those of the dictator of Russia, Joseph Stalin. In 1950, Truman ordered the U.S. military to go overseas and to contain communism and prevent it from spreading. There was never actually any fighting or war because there was a mutual understanding between both countries that if there were to be a war, it would be too gruesome and the death and destruction rate would be way too high. So they never actually went to war, but they did send troops over to contain communism. This is my grandfather. I call him Papa. His name is Artie Palese, and he enlisted in the Army when he was 18 years old in 1955. He was first stationed in Fort Knox, Kentucky, and then he was stationed in Germany, and he was part of a communications team, and basically his job was to control the borders between Eastern and Western Germany, and they just had to patrol the borders. They were never on call for anything. He said there were a few instances where they almost were, but nothing ever serious. He described it as the attitude was, you're watching us and we are watching you. After the start of the Cold War, a competition arose between the two nations known as the arms race. Both countries wanted to out-bomb each other. This led to a lot of fear in households in the United States. In the United States, a lot of families were so afraid of the bombing that they built their own bomb shelters. This is just a picture of like a homemade one of what a typical one might have looked like. I asked my grandfather if they had one, and he said that his family never did, but he did know a few people who were in the process and did actually build their own. The Soviets tested their first atomic bomb, and then Truman fired back with his idea of the famous H-bomb. Over the years, this competition between the nations continued, especially with the space race. Russia landed the satellite Sputnik first in 1957, but once again we had to one-up them, and in 1969 the Apollo 11 space mission was launched. Neil Armstrong was the first man on the moon. When asking my grandfather about this event, he said he could remember it. They're starting to forget a lot of details, him and my grandmother, but they did tell me they were all sitting in the living room watching it on their TV. They said it was a really small TV, but they do remember it being a really groundbreaking event in our history. While asking my grandfather also more questions, it was mainly an interview with him, but my grandma also had to put in her 2 cents. She said that one of the most influential events of the time on her was the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He was assassinated November 22nd, 1963, and she said that she remembered this really clearly because it was the day that they were moving out of their first home into their second home, and she said they got nothing done because all day long they were glued to the radio, glued to the television, watching to see what had happened. Another huge part of this era was the hippie movement towards the 60s. Hippies, described by my papa, were flower children that were fighting war efforts in Vietnam at the time. Oops. My grandmother had some interesting ways of describing the hippies, but that's a whole another speech in itself. Other really important events that took place during this time were the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. Basically what the Bay of Pigs was Kennedy's plan to invade Cuba. There was a lot of issues with Fidel Castro, who was their leader at the time. He was trying to get rid of all U.S. involvement in their country, and unfortunately the plan proved to be unsuccessful while Kennedy was in his presidency, but the plan itself was a big part of the whole country's history. The Cold War ended with the destruction of the Berlin Wall in 1989, removing the barrier between Eastern and Western Germany. The Soviet Union itself pretty much fell apart, and then that was pretty much it. Our troops that were containing came home for the time being. As you know, there was a new battle rising in Vietnam. The Cold War era held years of growth for our country and society. Learning about my grandfather's experience in home life and while he was in the military during this time taught me a lot about life back then. He did want me to mention his claim to fame when he was in the barracks in Germany. He was in it was called, well, I forget what his barrack was called, but he was in the barracks and he was deployed home 2 weeks after Elvis Presley was deployed to his same barracks. So his claim to fame is that he was almost in the army with Elvis Presley while he was in Germany. But overall, it was a really influential time, and I think it would have been really exciting to live then. Even though it was scary at times, I think it would have been cool because there was a lot of defining events that took place during them.